So
Yeah.
to start off our program today, I'd just like to welcome all of our participants. It's great to see you joining in the chat, letting us know a little bit about where you're joining in from today. And again, any comments that you have throughout the program, we'd love to see that coming into the chat. Please just remember to have your settings to host and presenter, so both myself, Danica, and Eric can see those coming in. If you have questions, which we'd love to see, we would like those to go into the Q&A in the bottom, but I'll be keeping an eye out on both the chat and the Q&A throughout the program to catch all of those questions from you. So to start today's program, I'd first like to say how grateful I am to be teaching and learning and living on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Since time immemorial, they have been incorporating the practice of observation and storytelling in all that they do, and through education and research, with OceanWise, we love to learn and incorporate those best practices in our programs. And so we're always so grateful to have that opportunity to continue learning from those people and being able to build that into what we do in our programs each and every day. And so I'd like to give a big warm welcome to our Director of Arctic Programs, Eric, and I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm just seeing if I can share my screen. Giving you a sense of what we're going to talk about. First question, another thing for you to think about. Normally, I would simply ask you to tell me your thoughts on this, but think a little bit about what comes to mind when you first hear the word Arctic. So the first things that come into your mind. We actually ask this question of our visitors and our audiences a fair bit. So we have a pretty good sense of what people think about when they hear the word Arctic. And we hear things like, well, it's white, it's desolate, or it's uninhabitable. Tell that to the people who've, ancestors have been there for thousands of years. We hear it's cold and dark, and it is often cold, and it's dark, well, half the year anyway. A new frontier is another one that we hear. And again, for those who have lived there for so long, the idea that it's a new frontier is a bit odd. In terms of animals, if you think about what's the first animal that comes to your mind, for probably the first 6 or so years that we asked this question, the answer was usually penguins. Now, there are no penguins in the Arctic. I forgive you if you thought there were, but there aren't. And my point here being that if that's your impression in general about what the Arctic is, then it's kind of like Jupiter's moon Europa, only with polar bears wandering around. And when you think about that, the idea of a little bit of change probably isn't necessarily all that bad. And it can look like that. This would be a picture in February. But it also can be bright and amazing and colorful with all kinds of amazing wildlife. And this is not going to be a talk about Arctic wildlife by any means. And but to ensure that you understand that the Arctic is in fact tremendously diverse and alive with life. It's dynamic. So there is one species, though, that I do want to bring up because it's a species that is often not discussed very much when we talk about climate change, but it is one that is tremendously impacted too by climate change, just to make the point that people live in the Arctic and have for a very long time, and that people in the Arctic are also greatly impacted by the changes that we're going to be talking about. And for people who live in the Arctic, 85% or so being indigenous, being Inuit, the connection to the environment is inextricable from the cultural and social and economic and other contexts. So the environmental issue is tied to their lives in many important ways. So things are changing. I talked about that. I'm not going to show a lot of graphs, but I'll point out here, this is just the difference in the temperature from what would have been considered average over this period of about 1700 years. And all I want you to see here, this is global temperature, is while things go up and down a lot, things have gone up a heck of a lot and really fast over just the last 200 years or so. Now, what does that mean for the Arctic? So this is now it's a shorter time frame, so the graphic is more flat. It's not as sharp looking, but it's still the same kind of increase. The red is the global temperature increase now. And the only thing I want you to notice here is that the Arctic is warming at about twice the rate of the rest of the planet. So global is the red, blue is the Arctic, and when you compare how the temperature has changed relative to an average from 1981 to 2010, what you see is that while the rest of the planet has about a 1 degree increase, the Arctic has increased, well, about 0.6 to 1 degree. The Arctic has increased by about twice that much. Now, the Canadian Arctic specifically is warming faster than anywhere else on the planet, and almost to 3 times the global rate. So it's not even on this chart. Now, a lot of folks could say, well, that's not necessarily bad, right? I mean, you know, it's just going to be more comfortable for the animals, and you know, we all like warmth. Warmth is good and cold is not so good. But there are some things that are really important to keep in mind. And one of those, of course, is that rising temperatures have effects on life in the Arctic in a whole bunch of different ways. And everything on the planet is adapted to the conditions in which, you know, their ancestors basically have lived over a very long time. So what are your options when the conditions start to change? So populations can try and go higher where it's cooler, and you see that in the mountains. Populations can go deeper if they're in the ocean and need colder water, but that's not always an option. And in fact, in the Arctic, when you go deeper, it actually gets warmer, believe it or not, at least for a certain depth. Or you can head towards the poles. And the reality is what we're seeing across the planet is that species are moving towards the poles. They're heading south if they're in the southern hemisphere. They're heading north if they're in the northern hemisphere. And on average, and the point here is that's average, we're talking about for ocean species about 78 kilometers per year, per decade. That doesn't sound like much, but that's the average. And so I'll get back to that in a second. So specifically within the Arctic, there's about 21,000 known species in the Arctic and a whole bunch more that we don't know yet. The vast majority are very much cold adapted. They're used to that cold and they need that cold. Different species have different ranges of temperatures they can handle. And if you live in the Arctic, it's because you require that colder temperature. And what we see is that things in the Arctic also begin to move north towards the pole. Now, of course, once you get a certain point, there's nowhere else to go, and that in itself is a problem. But you also see that other species are moving north into the Arctic as their ranges are able to extend because the conditions change enough. And so we're starting to see things like you know, new species that haven't been detected in the Arctic showing up. We're seeing changes, things like killer whales now, which are predicted to become the major predator in the Arctic and kind of pass polar bears as that major influence predator in the Arctic. We also, though, are seeing a whole bunch of other examples. So this was last year in while I was there last summer, a gentleman, an elder in the community, had this shark show up in one of his nets. Turns out it's a salmon shark. And It turns out it's a salmon shark that was about 3,000 kilometers from its northern extent of its known range. So it had traveled north and then it had traveled east. And what we're finding is a lot of species are doing that. Once they get north, there are a bunch of ways they start to travel east or travel west if they're coming from the other side. Now, also in Kaluktuk last week, Facebook was all abuzz about this guy or gal, I don't know, sorry, um, American white pelican, about 1,000 kilometers from the northern extent of its known range. Two of them have been hanging out for about a week in Kaluktuk. There are all kinds of more examples. This was last month, Pond Inlet. So last year around this time, some folks in Pond Inlet sent me a picture of a seal and said, "What the heck is this?" Now we're talking about people, elders and hunters who see something like this and haven't seen it before, don't know what it is. So last month, another one, and in this case, it's got a face maybe of a harp seal, and the rest kind of, at least pattern, looks kind of like a harbor seal, but there's, so the point here is that elders, hunters, people in the community are seeing things that they've never seen before, don't know what they are, and they're showing up. Now, those are some of the direct kinds of impacts on species. We'll talk now about some of the indirect impacts, because there's a lot of them, but we're going to focus mostly on sea ice, changes to sea ice and what that means in particular. For most of the year, the Arctic Ocean is covered with sea ice. That doesn't mean that there's nothing there. In fact, that sea ice you're going to find is tremendously important to support life. So let's talk about that for a second. The question here is, what do soil and sea ice have in common? Seem like two really different things to be comparing. So the reality is that both allow for entire ecosystems to exist that couldn't exist without them. So if you think about, for example, a forest. A forest exists because there's soil for the plants to grow in. And those plants are tremendously important because they're getting energy from the sun, nutrients from the soil, they're turning it into food that actually then creates the energy and the nutrition for the entire ecosystem in that forest. That's a huge important role, and it requires the soil to be there or the plants aren't there. So when we think about sea ice, this is actually a picture from under the ice now, looking up towards the ice. And what you'll notice here is that it's kind of green underneath. And the sea ice underneath, this is now a piece of the ice that we pulled out from the hole in the back of that picture. And you're looking at the underside, the undersurface of the ice, and it's kind of brownish green. What you're looking at is algae. And the algae lives on the underside of that ice. It grows kind of as a mat. Algae in the ocean plays the same kind of role that the plants in the forest play for that ecosystem, in that it gets energy from the sun, nutrients from the water, turns it into food, and that then is the base of the food chain that provides the energy and the nutrition that works its way all the way up the food chain. So in a way, you could sort of think of it as, if you turned that forest upside down and said, well, the soil is up there and the plants grow downward instead of up, it's kind of the same idea. So that algae that lives under there, that is so important, is then feeding tiny little critters that also live on and even within little channels within the ice, mostly crustaceans and things. They in turn feed things like the Arctic cod, which then feed a whole bunch of other things. And the Arctic cod is a tremendously important species in the Arctic, where, off the coast of British Columbia, if you're, say, a seal and you eat fish that's maybe, 12 centimeters long or so, 18 centimeters long, you have a bunch of different species you could choose from and when you're thinking about what to have for lunch. If you live in the Arctic, um, and you want to eat fish in the water column about that size, well, it's actually Arctic cod that is your primary go-to. There's not a lot of other species. There's a few, but not a lot of other species. That Arctic cod, in turn, provides food for so many other things, all the way up to and including people in the Arctic, all supported by the algae that's on the underside of that ice. Sea ice is also critical habitat in terms of being a platform that life lives on and under, being a source of protection. It keeps, for example, killer whales from being able to get at narwhals. It provides a place for seals to have their pups. All kinds of important aspects that make sea ice sort of this habitat that way. It's also critical for people. And for people, sea ice is both a source of food and clothing, and also the way you get to that food and clothing. It's your highway, it's how you travel. So it's an essential part of food security in the Arctic. It's not like you can just go to the store and get lots of good nutritional food really cheap. And the carbon footprint of that food is pretty ridiculous anyway. Um, it's also as partly a reason, or as a result of that, it's also tremendously important from a social, a cultural, economic, nutritional standpoint, and overall human health and well-being. That sea ice is what supports that. Um, it's how people get to other communities. You travel over the sea ice. It's how, you know, kids hockey teams get from whatever, you know, Pond Inlet to Clyde River. It's how people spend their weekends, go out to their cabins or their favorite fishing spots. So sea ice is incredibly important for people as well. And because wildlife is so important for people in the north, it's all connected. Now, what about you? So first of all, it's important to recognize that sea ice in the Arctic is actually your air conditioner. It is having an impact on your weather. It's having an impact on your climate. And it does this in various ways. So first of all, one of the important things that sea ice does is that when the sun beats down on the planet, the white ice reflects that sun's energy back up into the atmosphere, as opposed to it getting absorbed by the dark ocean in the form of heat. Now, when the ocean absorbs that energy, oceans are great at storing and moving energy all around the planet. They're like, think of them as like a battery that is mobile. So they're absorbing all that energy in the form of heat, and then they transfer it all over the place by currents all around the planet. Um, the more sea ice we have, the more of the sun's energy is reflected instead of absorbed into the ocean. And that actually helps keep our planet cool. Sea ice also, it turns out, and more evidence mounting on this, that it has a fair bit of control over a whole bunch of major currents that actually move that energy around the planet. So, for example, some of the key currents that keep Europe warmer than technically it should be at the latitude that it is, that's because of currents that are primarily driven by things that are going on in the North Atlantic that sea ice has an influence on, that actually allow those currents to even happen, that pulls warmth up from the tropics to the coasts off Europe and helps warm Europe. Well, it turns out that the Arctic plays a huge role in making those currents work. And the Arctic also, it turns out, is occurring more and more with more and more strong evidence uh, to be a key factor in some of these aspects of really erratic weather patterns that we've been seeing over the last several years. So lots of, and we don't have time to go into all the mechanisms. That's a whole other set of talks. But the key thing here is that the Arctic actually plays a role in what makes your life comfortable for you. And things are changing. So let's talk about sea ice for a second. So what you're going to look at here, this is basically what happens is the sea ice every summer starts to melt back. It doesn't melt back entirely, but it starts to melt back a bit. And by September reaches sort of the minimum it's going to reach in terms of the extent of sea ice across the Arctic, and then starts to freeze back up again after that. So what you're looking at here is basically every week from 1979, which is when satellites first started looking at this stuff, to last, well, actually this one stops at 2018, I'm afraid, but and what you're looking at then is the September average for each of these years at the sea ice minimum, the lowest point during the year of sea ice. And what you're seeing is a very clear decline in the amount of sea ice. And this year would be down right around here. I think you can see my cursor. So this year, this last summer would have been down right around here. Sea ice is declining incredibly, and that has huge impacts, and we'll talk some more about that. Let's see if I can skip this. There we go. Now, it's not just the amount of area that sea ice covers, it's also how thick it is, and the thickness has to do with how old it is. Some of the sea ice melts back during the summer, but a lot of it, well, less and less now, but makes it through the summer and continues for another year. It gets thicker. And so thick ice is old ice. Now, what you're seeing here, this is going to be every week since 1990. And the brightest white colors are the oldest ice. They can be, up to 9 or more years old. So in 1990, that's kind of how it looked. With all that bright white. Over here, you see something called the Beaufort Gyre. And the Beaufort Gyre is like an old ice factory. It's where the sea ice just has gone around and around and around for many years, getting older and older. And every once in a while, bits sort of come out and escape that gyre. But it's been this old ice factory for a very long time. As we get now closer and closer to 2020, you're seeing a very clear decline in the amount of that old ice, and the Beaufort Gyre is kind of breaking down, and the amount of old thick ice in the Arctic has really, really declined massively. That's a big difference, and it matters because that thicker ice is more likely to survive a warm year than that thin ice, but it also has a bunch of other implications. One of the things is that, first of all, we've lost a massive amount of habitat. So far, if you just look at 1979 or so to now, directly, you're talking about a little more than 1 million square miles of sea ice difference, but about a 40% decline in the amount, in the cover of sea ice. And that's just the cover. It's also decreased in thickness a whole bunch. That creates all kinds of stressors and changes in the ecosystems. But it also creates a lot more access, and it creates access for ships, for example, and we've seen drastic increases in ship traffic in the Arctic. That brings all kinds of potential issues ranging from potential spills and introduction of non-native species to the fact that the Arctic is getting noisier, and we know from research that happens with ocean-wise, with Valeria vergara, for example, that noise has a significant impact on animals like belugas and narwhals. lots of international fishing interests. If you think about it, the Arctic Ocean has been covered for a very long time, and all of a sudden, you've got an ocean, the last ocean that has not been fished in any substantial way commercially, about to become available. And lots of folks are interested in that, of course. Mining, oil, gas, tourism, all kinds of things that happen because the Arctic is more accessible. Those are not exclusively bad. They have advantages, of course, and it presents opportunities and all kinds of things. But we have to think about, what the other kinds of impacts are. For people, it means major threats to food security. The sea ice is far more dangerous and less predictable. This gentleman here on the right, his name is Saul. I've known him for quite a long time. He's an elder in Joe Haven. And I asked him one time what all these changes meant to him. And he actually, he sat quietly for a second, and then he said, well, and I'll paraphrase, but he said, I've been spending my entire life learning about the Arctic and the ice and how to navigate on the ice and how to read it, how to hunt and provide for my family. I learned from my elders. Now my job is to pass that on to my community. And he said, but things have changed so much. I can't read the ice anymore. I can't navigate the ice the way I used to. I can't tell when it's safe and when it's not safe. And he said, my knowledge is getting kind of irrelevant. And that was a really powerful thing to hear from somebody who's basically saying, their role in society has been impacted, so many ways. So it's important for people, of course. What about you? Well, more erratic and extreme weather for sure. Things like these Arctic blasts that we see, the changes in currents, the increases in sea level. The reality is that warming Arctic, and it's this weird kind of feedback thing, but a warming Arctic actually increases the rate of global warming, which increases the warming of the Arctic, which increases the rate of global warming. So, and it has to do with several things. One of those being that effect that I was showing you about how the ice deflects the sun's energy. So clearly we need a plan. We got to figure out what are we going to do about this. And we need a plan for, say, how to adapt. We need a plan for how we're going to, manage this increasing ship traffic. In fact, we kind of need a lot of plans. And we've got a lot to figure out. Well, the good news is we have a way to know this stuff, right? What we'll do is we turn to science and we say, well, let's take the science and figure this stuff out. Science is our best way of knowing these kinds of things. And the reality, however, is a little bit different than that. So if you think about what we know about the Arctic versus what we wish we knew about the Arctic from a scientific perspective, there's a big difference. And if you think about it, science is actually a pretty young sport in the Arctic. The idea that through I guess science as we would currently define it maybe has kind of been happening since around the 17th century. There's been lots of study of the environment and things since way before that. But from a science perspective, we're talking about around the 17th century, maybe 400 years or so. Fair enough. And during that time, we have managed to figure out a lot of things about a lot of regions of the planet. However, not so much in the Arctic. And through the 1800s even, expeditions were far more interested in discovering the Northwest Passage or finding the people who never came back from trying to discover the Northwest Passage to actually do a lot of science. And it was the late 1800s that there was the first real sort of concerted effort to try and do some scientific study. But really, all the way up until 1889, people thought that there was likely this big open ocean above all the sea ice. Even that, it was 1889 that was finally disproven, and it was actually on that same trip, um, that same expedition, that the first oceanographic data from the Central Arctic was ever even collected. So now we're talking 1889. Um, so given that, we're talking maybe 130 years of scientific study, really, of the Arctic. During almost all of that time, the Arctic has been either completely inaccessible due to ice cover or only accessible for a few months of the year. So, we've basically, walked, climbed, paddled, driven, sailed, whatever, pretty much everywhere on this planet for a very long time. But that's just not the case in the Arctic. Now, I want to point something out, because those of you who do know me would know that if I were listening to someone else giving this talk, I'd be jumping up and down right now, screaming angrily, saying, hold on a minute. There have been people living in the Arctic for millennia, and they have tremendous knowledge about the Arctic. They've been passing that knowledge down for those millennia. And so to that, I guess I would turn to that heckler and say, yeah, you're right. And I'd probably look at that person and say, remember that I started this conversation with the idea that decisions are generally made on science for our society. And for those decision makers, what counts as science really means Western science. The other thing to keep in mind is that the parts of the Arctic historically inhabited by people have been mostly coastal. And so much of the Arctic, in fact, still has not really been known by people. However, I'm going to come back to this importance of that local indigenous knowledge in a minute. All right, so this is the thing then. If there's a system that's changing, there are certain things we have to ask ourselves, certain things we have to understand in order to be able to respond to that change. And in this case, yes, this is a very simplified thing, and there's no science, and there are no journal articles to cite in this whatsoever. But the point here is that, first of all, we have to understand what the current situation is, what lives there, and how, what are the relationships, what are the systems that work in this, in this particular case. Then we have to understand what's actually changing. Then we have to understand what all of that means. Then we have to understand what we can actually do about it, all of that, before we can really have some kind of a way to address it in general. Now, with climate change in general, we're already here. We understand, we don't know everything, but we definitely know enough to know what we need to do. That's great. And we're still battling, all the political and other issues on what that means. When it comes to the Arctic, we're actually still down here in many ways. We're still trying to understand what's there. We're literally doing scuba dives to see what's there. And we're trying to understand those things while they're starting to change. And so we're racing to understand what's there as we see things also changing. We're getting a sense of what some of those implications are, but the reality is we're still trying to define the system while we're having to do all of these things. And that's not a great place to be. So bottom line is, well, we need more science. And fair enough. That's great. Science is absolutely important. But we're in a bit of a bind here, because the rate and the magnitude of the change that we're talking about is such that science is not particularly good to keep up. Science is in itself a very slow process, and that's important. It was designed that way. Science as a process requires that any knowledge that we're going to use, to create action, has to have gone through certain criteria and processes and so on. It has to, the data have to be collected and analyzed and so on. But then beyond that, there's a whole process of peer review where other scientists look at it and debate it and discuss it. You then try to publish it, which takes a very long time. In fact, the peer review process in publishing takes on average between 150 and 250 days just to have a journal agree or decide not to publish your work in the first place. Then it takes another 50 or so days to publish it. Then the real peer review starts, because that's when the real debate and discussion and arguments start happening. And there may not be a consensus on the work that you did 10 years ago until 10 years from now. That's how science was designed, and that's not a bad thing, but it is a slow process. So if we can't wait to get a whole bunch of new science, what can we do to at least feel a little bit better? And one of the things that we do is we say, well, we're going to make our decisions based on the best available science. Fair enough. The best available science certainly must be better than no science at all. When we're talking about the Arctic, however, it's kind of a pretty low bar because there's not a lot when it comes to some of the key things that we're trying to make decisions about anyway. Not necessarily a lot. And sometimes that science might be not peer reviewed. It might be, for example, industry that hired a consultant to do some work to determine some things so they could get some permits to do what they need to do or whatever it might be. That might be the only bit of research in a particular topic, and we'll make that decision as it is. So given that, the best available science in the case of the Arctic is kind of a low bar too, and may be a bit cheating when it comes to trying to win this race. So we have to think a little bit differently. Does that mean that this is all hopeless? No way, not at all. Absolutely not. So what it means is, first of all, I'll show you here in a second. We actually have what we need to make up for this lost time, to start gaining some traction here in this race. One thing that is important, though, is we do have to recognize that this is not someone else's problem to solve, okay? We have a tendency to go, well, you know what? These are scientific issues. These are political issues. And science and politics will have to deal with them. The reality is that's not going to work. We actually have to recognize that this is also our problem. So first of all, do we need more science? Absolutely. Hey, I'm a scientist, so obviously, I would agree with that. But we also have to recognize the nature of the process, the time that we have, and recognize that science is a bit more about playing the long game. Now, there's another important piece here, though. What if I were to tell you that there's a whole body of tested, peer-reviewed research that has been going on for millennia that is right there, and in fact ready to help us make some of these decisions. The reality is there is. So local indigenous knowledge, it's not anecdotal. It might not be quantitative. It may be qualitative, but it's not anecdotal. In other words, what I mean by that is it's not just hearsay and people talking about stuff just because it's not written down. It's actually a whole long period of observation and testing and retesting, and then coming back and talking with the experts within the communities, arguing, debating, discussing, refining, coming up with new results. And the reality is, if you're wrong, you probably die. So there's a lot invested in this, and there's a tremendous amount of knowledge. So one of the things that we can do, that we need to do, is basically humbly ask the people that we probably should have been treating a lot better over the last couple hundred years for help. this knowledge is there, this knowledge is accessible, and the good news for us is that despite uh, the approach that we've taken in working with Indigenous people over quite some time, in my experience, people are in fact very willing to help share that knowledge. And of course, they would like a little more respect than they've had in the past, and I don't blame them. But the opportunity is there. And one of the things that we do at OceanWise, we work on a program called eCarvic, and where youth are being this bridge between research and their communities and culture and different ways of knowing and so on. And they've worked very hard, in fact, to develop different ways that researchers, Western scientists, and communities can work together to combine Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. And so it is happening, and it's a really powerful thing. Number three, we have to be thinking more from the standpoint of a precautionary principle. We have to be saying, look, using the best available science, the best available knowledge, the reality is that kind of gives us a false sense of security. It's important that we do that, but if we're only doing that, it's a false sense of security because it's not, we're making decisions, that based on things we don't really have the information for. We have to have the courage to slow down and to stop those kinds of things that we suspect, but still can't quite yet prove are having negative impacts. We have to err on the safe side. We also have to recognize that when it comes to activities that can be impacting the environment, this isn't some court of law where you're, innocent until proven guilty. We have to instead be thinking, maybe we have to say that our actions when it comes to the environment, maybe it's guilty until proven innocent. Maybe we need to assume that we might be having more of an impact, and plan accordingly. And then the other part of it, of course, is consider taking action, even if we don't have all of the proof that says that is the the specific thing that's going to make that big difference. So that's an important part. Now, the last one here is it's great to figure out how to run faster, right? But what if you could actually slow down your opponent? That seems like a pretty good way to start gaining some ground too. And I want to be clear. This is not about stopping climate change. Honestly, it's too late for that. But that doesn't mean it's too late for us. It just means it's too late to stop climate change. And what that means then is, what can we do? We can slow it down, and we can bring it to a point that when it really hits its maximum impact, that maximum impact is lower than it could have been. And so we can do those things, and that's where all of us come in more directly. So I think of it as two things. One is, as individuals, yes, we can contribute less to the problem. And we'll talk about that in a sec. But we can also ensure that those who are in the position to have the biggest impacts in enacting solutions are doing so. So, we used to, and we do still, but we used to always say, well, the top 10 things you can do about climate change, drive less, turn off your lights, all those things. That's important, no question about it. But the rate of change and the magnitude of change and the magnitude of the solutions are such that government, industry, those are the players that can have the kinds of impacts that we need. But that requires us in order to ensure that happens. So yes, we need to think about our own carbon footprint, and we need to reduce it. And there's lots of tools to do that, and lots of people showing how effective that can be. We have to start coaching family and friends, but gently, of course. Your informed vote is far more powerful than you may think, because now you're starting to amplify your impact. So understand what particular decision makers, politicians are concerned about, interested in, willing to do, and so on, and vote accordingly. also making sure that those decision makers understand what you think is important and holding them to account for that. Um, Again, they have a tremendous amount of power to make a big difference on these issues. So, we have the power to make sure they exercise that power. Um, Use your own buying power to push for change. And it wouldn't, for me, wouldn't be the first time that I have written a note off to somebody saying, you know what, you have an awesome product and I'd love to buy it, but that packaging, I just can't. Sorry. Let me know if you want some input on maybe how you could package it differently. But those things actually matter. They actually make a difference. Supporting organizations, there's lots of great organizations doing lots of great things. And another one that I think is tremendously important, and we spend a lot of time on this at Oceanwise in various ways, is empowering the younger generations with the knowledge, the tools, the encouragement, the motivation to act where we failed to do so. Honestly, I'm not a fan of the youth or leaders of tomorrow, or they're going to inherit the planet, that kind of stuff, because they're here now. They are taking and can take more leadership roles now. And let's face it, old dudes like me, we kind of failed. And so it's not the solution is not in me figuring out what to do. The solution is in ensuring that these younger generations understand the role that they can play and empower them to fix the problems that we weren't able to fix. So that's my own personal rant on that one. I'm going to actually leave it there. I apologize for the length of time that it took for us to get going, and we're well behind schedule, and I'm sorry about that. So I don't know if we still have time to answer questions, or if it's where we're sitting on that.
I think we probably have time to answer a couple of questions, and it's so great to see that our audience is all here with us, super engaged. So I'd love to answer a couple of questions that got sent in throughout the program. And then we'll hopefully try and wrap it up in around 10 minutes or so. So thank you to everybody, and thank you, Eric, for being able to spend the extra time with us today. And so a few questions that came in. One was that you talked a little bit about, the importance of sea ice to a variety of animals, and one of our audience members was particularly curious about kind of how it was impacting walrus or walrus populations, and does that come up in your conversations in some of these communities?
So yes, first of all, there's a fair bit of evidence that the decline in sea ice is affecting walrus at a population level. And walruses don't directly feed, for example, on the things that the sea ice supports. So they're not, for example, eating Arctic cod, right? So when that sea ice disappears, if Arctic cod disappears, that's not the issue for walruses. The issue for walruses is that they use the sea ice as a platform. It's where they haul out in large numbers, and as opposed to hauling out on beaches, for example. And there's pretty good evidence that as the ice-free period during the summer, for example, has increased in length, as the geographic extent of sea ice has decreased, walruses are having to spend a lot more time on the shores. And that in itself wouldn't necessarily mean there's a particularly negative impact on them. However, there are a lot of issues associated with that. For example, walruses, as interesting as they are, apparently they're not super bright, and they will, in a situation where they're all kind of together on a beach, they can create a stampede situation, for example, that can leave particularly a number of young in a pretty bad way, that you won't see on the sea ice. And also you'll find that walruses, particularly females with young, will often kind of find bits of ice to hang out on their own with their young, kind of apart from the rest of that big old herd. And that's not an option. If you don't have bits of sea ice, you have a beach, and that's where everybody is. So there is evidence that they're spending more time on the beaches that way.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think this question is referring to maybe the first graph that you presented at the beginning of your presentation. There was a reference to proxy-based records. And so one of the audience was asking what is a proxy-based record?
Yeah. So the deal with that, and let's see if it's probably, I think it was the very first, oh wait, there we go. I think it was this one. Yeah. So the purple stuff is stuff that we've actually measured with thermometers. Okay. Now, before that time, certainly going back, 1700 years, we weren't measuring this stuff with thermometers. And so we've had to come up with a different way to understand what the temperature would have actually been like, say, 1,000 years ago. And it turns out there are some really great ways that that can be done. And so these proxy-based records are different ways of inferring the temperature based on, for example, you can use percentages of gases or types of gases in the bubbles trapped in ice in glaciers that can be 100,000 years old, for example. You can analyze that air, and it doesn't say what the temperature of the air is, but it says what the content of the air is, and there are ways to infer temperature from that. You can also look at seafloor records. So you take a core of the seafloor and see specifically what tiny little organisms were alive 1,000 years ago, and you know what their temperature requirements are, and you can start to piece together things like that. There's a bunch of chemical analyses you can do, all kinds of things, and that's what those proxy-based records are. Those are looking at the temperature without a thermometer, but other things.